This is allegedly the warmest boot in the entire world. It was designed in the 50s and is still in use by some people in the military today. And it's called the bunny boot, aka the extreme cold vapor barrier boot. And we're gonna cut it in half to see what's on the inside, how it's structured, how they make the warmest boot in the world, and run some super scientific tests to see how warm it actually is. If you're like me, you have way too many passwords and way too many usernames and all these different websites and accounts and apps. And it makes it hard for everyday life, but especially when you're running a business. And that's why today's video is sponsored by NordPass. NordPass is a password manager and cybersecurity tool that was built by the same team that built NordVPN, the security privacy app used by millions of people today that have also sponsored some videos. NordPass has a variety of functions. It can autofill your passwords, generate complex, very secure passwords that my brain would never think of when I don't want to give away my passwords actually. And it also gives you password health updates. Like if your password is terrible and it's been used across the internet and it's older than 90 days, it'll tell you when it's time to update them. Because the problem is if you're like most people and you have like 1 or 2 passwords across the entire internet, if that gets stolen, they immediately hack into everything you own, or at least try, and all of your bank data, all of your website, all of your identity could quickly be in the hands of somebody else. And that's why having NordPass can be an important part of your internet security. And it doesn't just save passwords, it can also save your credit card and personal information. So NordPass is your one-stop shop for security and saving time while shopping on the internet. Because nobody likes filling out all the shipping information, all the credit card information, the billing address information over and over every single day, because who shops in reality anymore? Everyone shops online. So unfortunately, it's a reality that there's too many people out there trying to scam you out of your hard-earned money, your passwords, your credit card information, your social security number, everything that they can steal, they're trying to steal. So that's why NordPass is so important. So to get an exclusive NordPass deal and support the channel, plus 1 additional free month, you can go to nordpass.com/RoseAnvil or use the code RoseAnvil at checkout. That gives you that 1 month and also gives us credit, so they sponsor more videos. And thanks again to NordPass for sponsoring this video. So what is this boot? How did it come to be? What is the history of this boot? Well, the shortened and condensed version of it is one of the very first winter ready or cold weather boots out there was the Muckluck. The Muckluck was basically a canvas boot with a lining on the inside that was wool with a leather bottom on the outsole. The problem is canvas and leather let water in like crazy, so it's not great for wet environments. So then the next iteration of a winter boot was basically an LL Bean boot with a rubber bootie on the bottom with a leather upper. Once again, leather's not the most waterproof boot, so you would let water leach in through the top of your boot. But the rubber bootie didn't let any water in. So then they just went full on rubber and finally came out with the Mickey Mouse boot, which was the predecessor to this boot. It was basically this exact same boot, but with black all the way around, hence the name Mickey Mouse boot. And it wasn't quite rated up to the same standard this one was. Then finally we ended up with the bunny boot, which is the most hardy, the most waterproof, the most heat retaining boot that the military has ever made. And so that's kind of the lineage of how we ended up at this boot, which is, I think, is super interesting. And the Iron Snail has a whole video on this, kind of going through those in a little more detail if you want to check it out. But how warm is the bunny boot actually? Well, it was created to be the worst case scenario, the worst environment to ever be operating in the military in cold conditions, including Alaska, Siberia, and both the Arctic poles. For instance, the average temperature at the South Pole is -56 degrees Fahrenheit and -49 degrees Celsius. So these large, bulbous, oversized, ridiculous looking boots were designed to keep you warm from temperatures anywhere from -20 degrees Fahrenheit all the way down to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. And for the last time, I'm not gonna do Celsius and Fahrenheit the entire video, but that's -29 degrees Celsius and -51 degrees Celsius. Quite literally made to withstand the worst temperatures that you can experience on planet Earth, at least for the military. So we couldn't really fly down to Antarctica, and we couldn't really, it's summer, it's like 100 degrees outside. So we thought we'd do the inverse to test this. So we grabbed a popsicle stick, threw it in the boot, taped it up to see how long it actually would stay frozen for, how insulating this boot is, and here's the results. So pretty outstanding results. So the nice thing is, if you got a pair of these, or you end up with half of a pair of these, they will make great storage. They might replace your Yeti cooler. if you use them correctly. Because of how heavy duty they are and how warm they are, a lot of civilian people just use these boots as a work boot. People that are in Alaska like these boots. People that operate machinery and are operators in the winter love these boots. But according to Filson, it's not just civilians that still use this boot. According to them, the 2nd Infantry Brigade Combat Team Airborne, 11th Airborne Division, stationed in Anchorage, Alaska, still uses the bunny boots today. So since these are still in active use, we thought we'd do a little waterproof test to see if they really are waterproof. So we put them in our dunk tank. And the thing is, these are the most buoyant boots we've ever had. We basically had to fill them up all the way with rocks and really weigh them down to get them to even stay in the thing. But as you can see, it stayed in there for 5 minutes, no leaks, no nothing. But the nice thing is they clearly can double as a flotation device. And that's one of the key characteristics of this boot being waterproof, and it's caused by the fact that it's basically all rubber. It's rubber on the outside, it's rubber on the inside. So why would they choose rubber? Well, because it's 100% waterproof, it's 100% not breathable, it's a lot more flexible than a lot of materials, and it's not as prone to cracking after years and years of flexing it over and over again. But it also makes these boots really easy to build and construct. The vulcanizing process makes it a seamless and stitchless process. So that also adds to the benefits of this boot. And these boots have some interesting features. You can see at the heel here, they've got a little hook here that was made for snowshoes and skis. They also made these boots super easy to patch because it is just rubber. You just put basically a tire patch on wherever you get a hole, and they're as good as new. And being that it's a rubber boot, you'd maybe assume that there's a lot of synthetic materials on the inside, but allegedly it's fully wool, and wool is kind of the nature's perfect insulating material. There's a bunch of cool facts. We went over some of the facts in the Uggs video, but it's naturally static free. And I don't remember any of those facts. We'll just put a quick shot of me explaining them over top here. The coolest feature of this, aside from the super vague instructions printed on the actual boot itself, is the little air valve right here. So what is this air valve for? Because both the Mickey Mouse boot and this bunny boot had them. And a lot of people assume that you pump air in there to fill them up, but what it really is most of the time you're wearing these, it's supposed to be closed shut because you want to trap all the air that's in there, and you don't want air moving in and out of it. But this valve is basically a pressure relief valve. So if you happen to go up in airplanes, it says keep closed unless airborne. Well, the valve allows this air-sealed boot to pressurize as you go up and down in altitude, preventing them from potentially rupturing on your feet, which would be the scariest thing ever. But there are some definite cons with this boot. It's far from the perfect boot. Because it is rubber, yeah, there's no water or air that gets in, but there's also no water or air that gets out. So even in the instruction manual, they recommend changing your socks every single day, but also having that much water and sweat in your boot in cold conditions can be catastrophic, because if it gets really cold and you've got a bunch of water in there, it freezes, then all of a sudden you got trench foot and frostbite because you turned your foot into an icicle. Another con of this boot is just the fact that it is the most insulated boot in the world. They're just not comfortable. You know, you got high pressure points at the front of your shin and the back of your calf. They're not that flexible. They're just not made for long walks, big hikes. They're mostly made for semi-stationary use. And to prove the fact that these aren't the most athletic and great for hiking or especially running, we ran a quick little test where Brody put these on, ran as fast as he could, and then ran in his tennis shoes. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of difference between how fast he could run in these boots. Granted, they are size 14s, but still the point is made. But how does this boot actually work? How is it designed, and how is it supposed to keep your feet warm? Well, the structure of the boot is a big part to do with it, because you've got this big rubber shell on the outside. You've got a rubber shell on the inside that's basically creating two different layers. And then in between, you've got several layers of foam and felt and a fully gusseted tongue to keep all the water out as well. So essentially with those two layers, it's acting in the same way that a Yeti cooler does, or Hydro Flask, or infused hydration bottles do, where you infuse the flavor, where you're trying to stave off the three types of heat transfer: conduction, convection, and radiation. It fights conduction by having two separate layers separating you or whatever's on the inside of the bottle from the outside world. You know, because if you think about just a regular bottle, there's only a single layer between the outside and the inside, and that heat can transfer through the outside of the bottle onto the inside, outside of the boot, to the inside of the boot. But with this boot, there's no direct contact with the outside world, preventing that conduction heat because there's a gap between the two. The problem with that void is the air on the inside can still conduct that heat back and forth, and those convection currents can also transfer the heat, and that's where we get to the convection fighting aspect of this boot. Well, the bottle does that by creating a vacuum on the inside, so there's actually no air to communicate that heat to the inside of the bottle. Obviously, you can't have a vacuum sealed boot So the best next option was filling it full of insulation. And it works basically in the same way that insulation works in your house, where it traps the air inside of that really dense insulation so that those air molecules can't move nearly as much, and they can't conduct and convect that heat to the inside. And the third type of heat transfer, the radiation, the bottles do that by having like a shiny layer on the top to bounce that radiant heat back out. But with these boots, I'm not actually sure if they have a layer on the inside or if they even tried to combat that because of the situation. So we'll have to cut them in half to find out, because we've seen it in other boots with the winter boot series, where a lot of those boots had that reflective layer on the inside that would trap that radiant heat from your feet to the inside of the boot. But I'm not sure if this has one of those foil layers on the inside or not. So to answer that, let's cut this thing in half and see what's on the inside. But first, here's a couple of random facts that are kind of interesting. These are in the movie Fargo, in the infamous scene with the wood chipper. Go watch that at your own discretion. My roommate in college, Kalen, bought a pair of these because they're so insulating. They actually insulate from electricity too. So he's running a bunch of crazy science experiments in the garage. He used these to protect himself from grounding himself to the ground. Coolest roommate ever. And finally, these hit the runway. Artists Sterling Ruby and Raph Simmons brought these back on their runway show, and then later made a collaboration with Adidas on a version of this boot that was sold to I don't know who. So let's cut these in half. All right, we got them cut in half, and pretty difficult actually to cut in half with the knife, but the bandsaw made pretty quick work of it. So let's see what's inside. This has got to be the craziest looking inside of a boot that we've cut in half. Let me grab my caliper actually, because this is so much wool. Because this outsole has two separate layers. Both are just under ½ an inch thick, making the insulation of this boot just under an inch. And this is that layer of wool and felt that insulates you from the ground, but you also have this outsole that's fairly thick. That outsole is still 8 millimeters thick. So the total amount of material keeping you from the ground is 32 millimeters or 1¼ inches of insulation from the ground. And shockingly, they even got a shank in here. And this is probably the heaviest duty wood shank we've ever seen. Like, look at this thing, this is crazy. Now that's a wood shank. And something that's kind of interesting is I assume the same insulation would be wrapping the boot, but if you look at the upper, you've got this layer of almost like a fake shearling that is also wool. And something that Brody pointed out is everyone always talks about mil-spec being like, it's the best, it's mil-spec, but mil-spec really means it's up to the certain standards, and then they have a bunch of different people competing for contracts to make that standard at the lowest price possible. And it's really interesting that they have 3 separate layers of this wool. And you can see now on the inside how this pressure relief valve completely seals off the entire inside of the boot. And as for the thickness of the sidewalls, it's a double layer of this rubber material that has like the reinforcing fabric infused into it. And it ends up being about 2 millimeters thick. So fairly thick rubber throughout the entire boot. But is there any radiant heat shielding on the inside? It doesn't look like it. It looks like that was maybe one form of heat transfer that they left out. This is an even more perfect example of function over form, even more so than the jungle boots that we did a few days ago. That's like, that video was taken off. So if you haven't seen that one, check that one out. Because this was a boot that wasn't, how do we make a boot warm? It was, how do we make warmth a boot? And the crazy thing is, these aren't that rare. Every time we cut apart one of these military boots, people get upset about it. But there was so many of these on the shelves at the surplus store we went to. So you can get the warmest boot in the entire world for under $100. And they're all over the internet too. For like $100 you can get this boot, which is pretty crazy, especially after doing that winter boot series where none of them were really that great of winter boots. You can just go out and buy one of these. Obviously you're gonna look absolutely ridiculous in them, but that's where that form over function comes into play. People are willing to pay 5 times the price, 4 times the price of this boot to get a fourth of the insulation just because of how it looks, which is just how it is, but it is just a funny thought experiment of how we value things. So thanks for watching, and hopefully you enjoyed this one as much as I did. I love doing these military boots. So let us know what other boots you want us to cut in half and what you thought of these. And for sticking around to the end, and just because we can, and it would be kind of interesting to do, instead of testing these in the coldest of cold and making an ice bucket challenge for these, we thought we'd test them in the hottest of hots with the Anvil flamethrower to see how they perform in hot conditions. So thanks for sticking around to the end. See ya.